My husband's best friend demanded that he doesn't bring me on the vacation that I paid for so they can experience the good old days, and my husband agreed. So I just laughed in his face, threw all his belongings out of my house, and made sure he doesn't have a house to return to after he is back. Hi everyone, I'm using my phone to type everything out, so ignore any formatting mistakes. Also, English isn't really my first language, so if I make any typos or grammatical mistakes, then ignore those as well. Getting to what happened, my husband, Brandon, 28, male, and I, 30, female, met because of work 4 years ago. After dating for 3 years, we finally got married 1 year back. His best man was Fu, 28, male, who had been his best friend since middle school. Fu and Brandon were like brothers, according to everyone who knew them. But I personally was never a fan of the guy. He was just too loud and obnoxious, and we never managed to get along well for some reason. Fu was also weirdly possessive of Brandon, which never made sense to me. He'd occasionally invite himself on our dates, and I'd feel like the third wheel the entire time. He'd come over quite frequently for my taste, and whenever he did, he made sure to exclude me from all the conversations, making me feel like an outsider. Even when we'd hang out in a group with Brandon's other friends from school, everyone else would attempt to include me, but Fu wouldn't. I discussed these things with Brandon a couple of years into the relationship, but he laughed it off and said that I was getting too worked up and paranoid over a friendship. He thought that my reaction would be valid if Fu was a woman, but since he was a guy, there was no reason for me to feel so insecure. Brandon turned it into a joke, which is why I didn't bring it up again. His reaction made me feel stupid, and the whole issue just started seeming ridiculous, even to me. I didn't think that it was a red flag at the time, and I tried to deal with my feelings toward Fu by ignoring him and distancing myself from the guy. I was insecure about him, but I just didn't want it to show anymore because Brandon wasn't going to take it seriously, and I didn't want to make a fool of myself once more. So, I kept things to myself and didn't talk to her about Fu again. They continued to be friends, and after our marriage, Fu began to visit a little less because he had also started to see a woman and was serious about her. Brandon was happy for him, and I was relieved that they were reducing the time they spent together. Call me insecure or jealous, but it was a huge relief to me. Unfortunately, Fu and his girlfriend broke up a month ago because she wanted to move to another city for work, and he couldn't do long distance, so they had to end things for good. He was miserable for the next couple of days and actually spent those days sleeping on our couch. He claimed that he couldn't bear to be alone at the time, and Brandon looked upset too, so I didn't say anything and let him have his way. He finally did go back home after a few days, but then he started visiting regularly again, and the same behavior resumed. I was annoyed at his girlfriend for breaking up with him because of the repercussions it had on my personal life. I went back to tolerating him again, and this time it was more out of pity because he genuinely seemed upset about his breakup, and would bring her up often. However, Brandon would also talk about how bad he felt for Fu, and that would get under my skin because I was already putting up with Fu's visits. I didn't want to talk about the guy even after he'd left. It was as if their entire lives revolved around each other or something. I wanted to have some quality time away with Brandon because I was getting annoyed by Fu's visits, so I decided to surprise him with a 4-day trip to the Bahamas because both of us really love beaches, but I'd never been to the Bahamas before. I organized and paid for all of it, and 10 days ago, I decided to tell him about it. He was thrilled, and both of us were pretty excited since we'd both been working really hard for a while, and this vacation would be a well-deserved break. That excitement lasted for about 2 days until Fu showed up. Brandon told him about the trip, and all of a sudden, it was they who were going on that trip without me. As soon as Brandon told him that he was leaving for the Bahamas the next day, Fu instantly said that he was ready to go because life had been pretty boring after his breakup. I thought that he'd back off when Brandon told him this was supposed to be a trip that he and I were going on, but instead, Fu made a face and told me that I could stay home just this once so that he could relive the good old days with his best friend. I was stunned at what he was saying and expected Brandon to tell him that I was going on that trip and not him. But for some reason, Brandon decided that it was more important for him to be a better friend than a husband and looked at me to ask if he could go on the trip with Fu instead of me. I was stunned, and I didn't even say anything but instead excused myself to go outside and didn't return for about half an hour because that's how shocked I was. I'd always put up with their weird closeness, but that was really too much for me to handle, and I think anyone else in their right mind would have reacted the same way in a situation like that. When I came back home, Fu had left, and it was just Brandon and I again. I confronted him, and instead of trying to see where I was coming from, he told me that I was overreacting and being selfish. In his opinion, he and I could go take a vacation at any time we wanted to, but Fu needed this more right now since the poor guy had just been through a breakup and was going through stuff. So, he needed to be there for his brother and make sure that he was doing all right emotionally. I reminded him that I was the one who paid for this trip, and to that, he told me that he'd pay me back in installments once he was back from the vacation, which meant that he'd already made up his mind about going. Our flight was supposed to leave in the afternoon, but instead of packing, I spent the night and the next morning crying silently all alone in the guest room. I told Brandon that I wanted to be alone because I felt a cold coming on, which was a lie because I just wanted to be away from him at the time. Despite everything, I still held out hope that he'd sense that something was wrong and would cancel the trip, but he just told me to take care of myself before he left and didn't even hug or kiss me goodbye because he didn't want to catch my cold, which would ruin his trip. I was partly in shock and partly depressed because of what had happened. I hadn't seen it coming because I'd been totally blind to how much I loved Brandon, but that incident really forced me to take my rose-colored glasses off and see the reality of the situation. It was always going to be Fu over me for him, and it didn't matter if we were married, if I was pregnant, or maybe even after we'd had kids. Even then, I'm sure he'd choose Fu over his own blood because that's the kind of relationship they have. That day, I felt like I was going crazy because of the amount of jealousy that I felt, and I wanted to tell someone about it, but I didn't. I kept thinking about what Brandon had said the first time I brought up my problem with Fu and his friendship in front of him. I didn't want to come off as weird or insecure, so I didn't tell anyone. By the next day, I was seething and wanted to do something about this to hurt Brandon. So, I did some brainstorming, and I had plenty of time for that since I'd already applied for a leave from the office for 5 days for vacation. But then I decided that I'd use those days to come up with some way to hurt Brandon instead. Eventually, I settled on buying out the house, and then when he'd come back, I'd kick him out, and that would be the perfect lesson for him. The house that I lived in is the one that I've lived in for the past 7 years, even before I met Brandon. I'd been thinking about buying out the house for quite a while but hadn't discussed it with him because he often spoke of moving to Seattle, where his sister currently resides, because he's close to her. The lease of the house is, of course, in my name only, but I decided to make the big move and buy the house just to cement everything. My landlord was pleasantly surprised, and we managed to close the deal within 4 days. In the meantime, I'd also spoken to a friend of mine who's a lawyer and told her that I wanted to file a divorce petition on the second day. By the time Brandon returned from his vacation, I was ready with all these papers. I'd stayed home that day specifically to welcome him, and he was about to come and give me a hug, but I stopped him midway, shoved those papers toward him, and then told him that he had an hour to pack his stuff up and leave. He was surprised but took a while to read through those papers. After that, he began to laugh because he thought I was joking. It was infuriating, but I convinced him after a few minutes that this was all real and actually happening. That's when he started panicking and told me that I couldn't do this to him over something as petty as a vacation. When he said that, I lost my temper and started screaming at him about everything he had put me through so far. I reminded him yet again that this was a vacation that I'd paid for, and he had no right to even allow Fu to make such a ridiculous demand. He'd not only allowed Fu but also given in to his demand and insulted me for about the millionth time. But this time, I wasn't going to tolerate the disrespect. He told me I was acting crazy and said that my jealousy over a male friend of his was ridiculous and made no sense. Once again, his excuse was that Fu was a guy, so I had no reason to be insecure about him. But that wasn't the point. He kept picking his friend over his wife again and again, which just hurt. He was just not willing to see my side and kept telling me that I was overreacting to the situation and that it just wasn't that deep. He laughed after almost 3 hours of arguing because I was getting pretty hysterical, but even then, he told me that he was giving me some time to think things over before I made a mistake. He sent me several texts saying that I'm just making a big deal out of nothing. Brandon still thinks that Fu being a guy makes it all right because he's not an actual threat of any kind, but I don't understand why he doesn't understand what I feel. At this point, I'm honestly beginning to think that I might be overreacting, and that's why I'm on Reddit right now. Nobody else in my family or friends circle knows what's going on with me and Brandon yet because he hasn't told anybody and neither have I, but I really need to know if what I did was out of line or if he deserved it. Update 1. First of all, thanks to everybody who commented, regardless of what you guys said. Thanks for at least taking the time out to say something. I'm grateful for the ones who tried to let me know the truth gently and also grateful for everyone who gave me the harsh reality check that was much needed. I wasted more than 4 years of my life trying to win over Brandon, but I knew all along that I was competing with someone I could never defeat anyway. Oh, but my best friend isn't another woman, so you shouldn't have a problem with me prioritizing him over you is pretty much the lamest excuse there could ever be for someone to make their spouse feel like utter crap all the time. I feel awful that I wasted so many years of my life with this guy just because I loved him and was willing to give him as many chances as he needed to fix his behavior. But the problem was that he never even thought there was anything wrong with the way he'd been treating me all along and believed that it was perfectly normal for a married man to constantly want to spend all his time with his best friend, regardless of gender. It's a flimsy excuse and makes no sense because at the end of the day, he picked him over me, and I won't care if it's a man or a woman he picks, I'll still be hurt that I'm not his priority when he's very obviously mine. At least now I know where I stand, and I finally decided to make sure that I get out of this marriage before I end up wasting any more of my time. He's been texting me on and off for a week now to try and get back with me, but it's pointless. Even Fu tried to text me and explain that I'm overreacting and I'm the one who's making all this weird, but I don't really care what he thinks, so I blocked him. Brandon still hasn't responded to the divorce petition, but he has time, and I honestly don't believe he's going to contest it, so I'm not worried. Update 2. Well, Brandon cheated on me on that vacation, not with Fu, which at least I would have been prepared for, but with another woman whom he met on vacation. He'd only text me good morning while he was away, and I didn't properly respond to them but only said good morning back to him and left it at that so he wouldn't get suspicious about what I was doing back at home. On the fourth day, he texted me that he missed me and loved me a lot at 3 in the morning, which I found a little strange. But I didn't let myself get bothered because that would just make me feel weak, and I'd end up forgiving him yet again, which I didn't want to do this time. So, I ignored that text, and then after that, he came back home, and the things that I mentioned in my post took place. So I didn't have much time to think about that text. Today, I found out that he'd definitely sent me that text after he'd hooked up with this random woman he met at the hotel he was staying at. This woman reached out to me on Instagram and informed me that she'd hooked up with my husband just a couple of days ago, and all the details that she provided me lined up. She told me that he told her his real name and she'd planned for it to be a one-time thing, of course, but she thought that he was really cute, so she looked him up online and had come across his Facebook profile. Now, his cover photo is us on our wedding day, and that's how she realized that he was married. I'm not active on Facebook, and she didn't know I check my messages there, so she did some stalking and managed to find my Instagram account. She told me that apparently, Brandon and Fu had been in the hotel bar at the same time as them, and they brought her and her friend drinks. That's how they got to talking, and she and her friend hooked up with Brandon and Fu separately that night. She and her friend had an early flight back home the next day, and she found out about me within the next 2 days but hesitated about whether to reach out to me or not, which is why there was such a delay. She apologized to me and told me that if she'd known that he was married, she never would have hooked up with him. She didn't see a ring on his finger and didn't think much of it, so she went ahead with him. I honestly don't think the poor girl had to apologize because this wasn't her fault at all. She didn't even know he was married and was probably just trying to have some fun on her vacation. It should have been Brandon who knew better, but he's never been the type to know better, I know that much now. I was hurt when I read her message and cried a lot because it just felt so crappy, but deep down, I did know that this was for the best. I thanked her and told her that she'd actually done me a favor because we were currently in the middle of a divorce, and it had helped me. I asked if she could provide me with proof of her stay at the hotel around the same time that he'd been there. She was nice enough to agree to it immediately without question and even told me that I could reach out whenever I needed more proof at any point. So, ultimately, my husband did cheat, and it was his god-awful so-called best friend who encouraged it. I really wish I could claim to be surprised, but I'm not. I'm just really not surprised in the slightest. In fact, I really think that this was a long time coming. Who's to say this is even the first time they've done something like this? Brandon and Fu have hung out and been away on nights out several times, even after we got together, so I wouldn't even be surprised if this was a regular ritual of theirs, going out and picking up girls. I'm just disgusted at this point, there's nothing else I have to say on this. 3 weeks have passed, but he hasn't responded to the petition yet. He still has 10 days to go. This is definitely not going to help his case, and I'm really happy that this information stumbled into my lap like this. He deserves this. Update 3. I guess the woman texted Brandon as well because, last night, he called me up, begging me to give him a chance to explain. It had just been a couple of hours since I had posted my last update at that point, and I was really tired from work, so I told him that I wasn't interested in his side and just wanted him to leave me alone. But he didn't listen, as usual. Even after I hung up and then declined several calls, he continued to call me, so I was left with no other choice but to block him. Then, he decided to message me on Instagram and left me a really long text about how sorry he was and that he just had a moment of weakness. You know, the typical things that men say when they've cheated and want to make it seem like it's no big deal, so we should just forgive them and move on. He begged me to let him have one last chance at making our marriage work and even offered to attend marriage counseling. But let's be real, we're way past that point right now. Counseling isn't going to help any of this, and we both know it. So, I told him to go away and then blocked him on Instagram as well. I also blocked him everywhere else, just for good measure, because I didn't want him to have any access to me anymore. In case of emergencies, he could contact my lawyer. Update 4. So, he finally responded to the divorce petition. He's not contesting it, but he has decided that he's not going to agree to my settlement terms and wants to negotiate before the divorce is finalized. This is going to take a couple of weeks since the waiting period here is relatively shorter, like 3 months or something, I believe. He wants to negotiate and even has the audacity to demand alimony from me since I earn a lot more than him. You guys can only imagine how ridiculously stupid someone must be to try and do something like this after they've literally cheated on their spouse. It's annoying, but it's okay because I know I'll win, and I know he's digging his own hole, so I can only wish him luck with whatever he does. I spoke to him a couple of days back because he'd actually called up my parents to force them to hand me the phone, because for some reason, he thought that's where I was. I wasn't. I was away on a business trip for 3 days, and he'd probably come around to stalk me or something. When he didn't see the lights on at home, he concluded I must be hiding out of my parents to avoid him. He must be delusional if he thinks that I'm going to go to such lengths just to avoid him. He's not that important, and he's not much of a threat either because I know how big of a coward he is. Just to be on the safe side, I've decided to change the locks on my door and amp up the security around my house because I don't want him loitering. I heard from a few of our common friends that he's been living with Fu, which is no big surprise because, of course, he's going to live with a mistress once the wife kicks him out. I honestly don't even care anymore, and I really just wish I could get this divorce over with as soon as possible because I'm actually just done with this guy. I must have been crazy to even think that someone like Brandon could be my soulmate or whatever, even for a second. His soulmate was clearly Fu, and I just wasted all of our time by staying with him and putting my heart and soul into making a pointless marriage work. At least my parents were supportive of me and think I made the right choice. My friends are thrilled because they'd always believed that there was something problematic and off about the relationship that Brandon and Fu had and had always warned me about it. I was an idiot to shrug off their warnings and pretend like Brandon was the perfect guy for me, but hey, at least I came around before it was too late. We'd been discussing having kids for a couple of months before all of this happened, during the time that Fu was dating his ex and would come over less often. I'd agreed because I was getting older and wanted a healthy pregnancy. Now, I'm just grateful that I didn't get pregnant, and that we didn't start trying for a baby at the time because that would have been a total nightmare for everyone involved. I have all the evidence against Brandon, and the first mediation session is happening soon. We'll see how things work out. I don't care if he has any regrets right now or not, but I'm going to make sure that he regrets whatever he put me through by the time we're done with this. My feelings for him are all gone now, and I can finally see him for the loser that he really is and has been all along. Thanks for all the support.